The road to Giuseppe's farm was little more than a scar in the earth, carved by decades of neglect, and the occasional truck that had long since stopped coming. Marco drove his black Cadillac slowly, feeling every rut and stone beneath the tires, watching the dust rise behind him like the ghosts of men who had traveled this path before and never returned. The late afternoon sun hung low and red over the hills, casting long shadows across the fields of dead corn that stretched on either side of the road, stalks brittle and brown, whispering secrets to the wind that no one bothered to hear anymore. He had been driving for 2 hours since leaving the city, leaving behind the noise and the neon, the restaurants where the family conducted business over plates of veal and glasses of wine, the social clubs where old men played cards and young men learned the codes that would govern their lives. Out here there was nothing but silence and the weight of forgotten things. Marco lit a cigarette and cracked the window, letting the smoke curl out into the dying light. He was 28 years old, a soldier in the Lombardi family, ambitious and hungry in the way that young men are when they have tasted power, but not yet understood its cost. This assignment was supposed to be simple. Drive out to the old farm, find the old man, retrieve what he had hidden and return to the city before the Don's patience wore thin, but nothing involving Giuseppe Mancini was ever simple. Marco had heard the stories, whispered in the back rooms of the social club, half legend and half warning. Giuseppe had been a consigliere in the old days, back when the families still respected the old codes, when a man's word was his bond and betrayal was met not with lawyers and negotiations, but with blood and silence. He had served under Don Salvatore Lombardi, the current Don's grandfather, a man so feared that even now, 30 years after his death, soldiers still crossed themselves when speaking his name. Giuseppe had been the Don's shadow, the voice that whispered in his ear, the mind that turned problems into solutions and enemies into cautionary tales. Then, one night in the winter of 1987, Giuseppe disappeared. No explanation, no farewell, no body. One day he was sitting at the Don's right hand during a meeting with the Colombo family, negotiating terms that would reshape the territories across 3 states. The next day, he was gone. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said he had betrayed the family and fled before justice could find him. Others claimed he had been killed by rivals and his body dumped in the river. A few whispered that Don Salvatore himself had ordered it, that Giuseppe had learned something he was never meant to know, that his silence had been purchased with his life. But Giuseppe had not died. He had simply vanished, slipping away from the world of blood and oaths, and reappearing here in this forgotten corner of the countryside, living as a farmer, anonymous and invisible. For 38 years, he had existed in this self-imposed exile, and the family had let him, until now. Marco slowed the Cadillac as the farmhouse came into view, a sagging structure of weathered wood and peeling paint, its porch tilted at an angle that suggested it might collapse at any moment. The barn stood behind it, larger and somehow more solid, its red paint faded to the color of dried blood, its doors closed and locked with a chain that looked newer than anything else on the property. Chickens scratched in the dirt yard, and a single cow stood motionless in a pen, watching Marco's approach with the dull eyes of an animal that had long since stopped expecting anything interesting to happen. He parked the car near the house and stepped out, crushing his cigarette beneath his shoe. The air smelled of earth and manure and something else, something faint and acrid that he could not quite name. Decay, perhaps. The slow rot of things left too long in the sun. He straightened his jacket, feeling the weight of the pistol in his shoulder holster, a comforting presence that he hoped he would not need. The capo who had sent him, Vincent Carbone, had been clear in his instructions. Giuseppe was old and dying. He would not resist. All Marco had to do was talk to him, earn his trust and find out where the old man had hidden the records. The records. That was what this was really about. 38 years ago, when Giuseppe had vanished, he had taken with him something more valuable than money or drugs or guns. He had taken the family's secrets, account numbers, names of informants, details of deals that could still bring down powerful men if they ever came to light. The new Don, Salvatore's grandson Anthony, had spent months tracking down every lead, every rumor, every whisper that might tell him where Giuseppe had gone. And now, finally, they had found him. Dying in a farmhouse that smelled of chickens and old wood, holding on to secrets that could reshape the balance of power in 3 states, Marco walked up the creaking steps to the porch and knocked on the door. 3 sharp raps that echoed in the stillness. He waited, No response. He knocked again, harder this time, and heard movement inside, slow and shuffling, the sound of a man who moved through pain. The door opened a crack, and a face appeared in the gap, lined and weathered, eyes pale and milky but still sharp, still watching. Giuseppe Mancini looked like 100 other old farmers Marco had seen in his life, dressed in overalls and a stained flannel shirt, his hands gnarled and scarred, his hair white and thin. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, of understanding, that told Marco this man knew exactly why he was here. Giuseppe did not speak. He simply opened the door wider and stepped back, gesturing for Marco to enter. Marco hesitated for a moment, then crossed the threshold into the dim interior of the farmhouse. The smell hit him immediately, thick and cloying, the smell of sickness and unwashed bodies and something sweeter underneath, like fruit left too long to ripen. The living room was cluttered with the debris of a life lived alone, newspapers stacked in corners, dishes piled in the sink visible through the doorway to the kitchen, a single chair facing a television that flickered with the sound turned down. Giuseppe closed the door behind them and shuffled past Marco, settling into the chair with a grunt of pain, his breath coming in shallow gasps. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Marco stood in the center of the room, feeling awkward and out of place in his expensive suit and polished shoes, a creature from another world intruding on this place of silence and slow dying. Giuseppe watched him with those pale eyes, and Marco had the uncomfortable sensation of being studied, evaluated, judged by a man who had once sat in rooms where the fates of cities were decided. Finally, Giuseppe spoke, his voice a rasp, dry and cracked like old leather. "They sent a boy." Marco felt a flash of irritation but kept his face neutral. "I'm a soldier in the Lombardi family. Don Anthony sent me to talk to you." Don Anthony. Giuseppe's mouth twitched, something that might have been a smile or a grimace. Salvatore's grandson. I remember when he was born. Cried like a little girl when they tried to put him in his grandfather's arms. Salvatore said the boy would never have the stomach for this life. He coughed, a wet, rattling sound, and spat into a handkerchief. Guess he was wrong. Marco moved closer, pulling up a stool that sat near the chair and sitting down so that he was at eye level with the old man. "Don Anthony knows you have something that belongs to the family. Records, information. He wants it back." "Wants it back." Giuseppe's laugh was bitter, more cough than humor. It was never his to begin with. It was never any of theirs. Those records, they are the truth, the real history of what we did, what we built, what we destroyed. Men died to keep those secrets buried, others killed to make sure they stayed that way. And now your Don wants them back so he can what? Use them, leverage them, turn them into weapons. "That's not my concern," Marco said evenly. "I'm here to do a job. You tell me where they are, I take them back to the city, and you can live out whatever time you have left in peace." Giuseppe studied him for a long moment, those pale eyes searching Marco's face as if looking for something he did not expect to find. "You really believe that, don't you? You think this is just a job? Drive out to the country, talk to the old man, take the prize, go home. You have no idea what you are reaching for, boy. No idea what those records contain or why I disappeared all those years ago to keep them from falling into the wrong hands." Marco felt his patience beginning to fray. He had driven 2 hours for this, and he was not in the mood for riddles and lectures from a dying old man who smelled like cow manure and regret. "Then tell me. Explain it to me. Make me understand why you vanished, why you hid out here for almost 40 years, why those records are so important that the Don himself sent me to find them." Giuseppe was silent for a long time, his gaze drifting to the window, where the last light of the sun painted the fields in shades of gold and crimson. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost wistful. "I was 23 years old when I became Consigliere to Don Salvatore, younger than you are now. I grew up in the neighborhood, son of a baker, nobody special, but I was smart. I could see patterns where others saw only chaos. I could turn a problem inside out and find the solution hidden in its guts. Salvatore saw that in me. He took me under his wing, taught me the codes, the oaths, the way this life works. I loved him like a father. I would have died for him without hesitation." He paused, his breath wheezing, his hand trembling as he reached for a glass of water on the small table beside his chair. He drank slowly, then continued. "For 15 years I served him. I sat in meetings with the other families. I negotiated truces and declared wars. I found the rats and made sure they disappeared. I kept the books, the real books, the ones that showed where the money came from and where it went. I knew every secret, every betrayal, every lie we told to keep the empire running. And then one night I learned something I was never supposed to know. Marco leaned forward, his irritation forgotten, drawn in despite himself by the old man's words. What did you learn? Giuseppe's eyes met his, and for a moment Marco saw not the dying farmer but the Consigliere, the man who had walked in the shadows of power and survived. I learned that Don Salvatore had betrayed the family. Not to the cops, not to the feds, not to another family. He betrayed the men who had built the empire with him, the men who had bled for him, who had trusted him with their lives. He made a deal, a secret deal with the Colombo family, to eliminate his own underboss and two of his most loyal capos. In exchange, he would get access to their drug routes, their connections in Miami and Los Angeles. He was going to kill his own brothers to expand his territory. The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Marco felt a chill run through him, a sense of the ground shifting beneath his feet. That's impossible. Don Salvatore is a legend. He is the foundation of the Lombardi family. Everyone knows the stories. He was loyal to his men always. He lived by the code. The code. Giuseppe's laugh was harsh, mocking. The code is what we tell ourselves so we can sleep at night. Loyalty, honor, respect. Beautiful words. But in the end, this life is about power. Who has it? Who wants it? Who will do anything to keep it? Salvatore wanted more, and he was willing to sacrifice his own men to get it. I found the proof. Letters, recordings, meeting notes, all hidden in a safe in his office. I was looking for something else, and I found them by accident. And in that moment, I realized that if I stayed, if I revealed what I knew, I would be dead before the sun came up. Marco shook his head, trying to process what he was hearing. So you ran, you took the records and disappeared. I did not run. Giuseppe's voice was sharp, indignant. I made a choice. I could have used those records to destroy Salvatore, to tear the family apart, to bring down everyone. But that would have meant war, chaos, bloodshed, that would have consumed not just the family, but the entire city. Innocent people would have died. Families would have been destroyed. So I took the records and I vanished. I let Salvatore think I was dead. Let the family move on without me. I buried the truth out here, in this place where no one would ever think to look. And now? Marco asked quietly. Why did you stay here all these years? Why not destroy the records, burn them, make sure no one could ever find them? Giuseppe turned his gaze back to the window, his expression distant, haunted. Because the truth does not die just because you bury it. Those records are not just about Salvatore. They are about all of us, about the things we did in the name of loyalty and power. They are the testimony of men who are long dead, the evidence of crimes that shaped this city and this life. Someday, someone needed to know what really happened. Someday, the truth needed to come out. And you think that day is now? Marco asked. Giuseppe looked at him, and for the first time, Marco saw something like pity in the old man's eyes. I think that day is coming, whether we want it or not. The Don sent you here because he is afraid. Afraid of what those records might reveal, afraid of what might happen if the other families learn the truth about his grandfather. He wants to control the story, to bury it deeper. But the truth has a way of finding the light, boy, and when it does, it burns everything it touches. Marco stood, feeling the weight of the conversation pressing down on him, the sense that he had walked into something far more complicated than a simple retrieval job. Where are the records, Giuseppe? In the barn? The old man smiled, a thin, sad smile. In the barn, hidden where only someone who knows what to look for will find them. But before you go digging through my past, you should know something. Those records are not just paper and ink. They are lives, dozens of lives, men who trusted Salvatore and paid the price. If you take them back to the Don, he will use them to protect his legacy, to silence anyone who might threaten his power. And you, Marco, you will become part of that silence. You will become one more man who chose power over truth. Marco felt anger flare inside him, hot and sudden. You don't know me. You don't know what I will or won't do. No, Giuseppe agreed. I don't. But I know this life. I know what it does to men like you. Young and ambitious, hungry for respect. It gives you power, yes, but it takes something in return. Your conscience, your soul, your ability to see the difference between loyalty and complicity. I made my choice 38 years ago, now you have to make yours. Marco turned away, walking to the door, needing air, needing space to think. He stood on the porch looking out at the barn, at the chain that locked its doors, at the secrets that waited inside. Behind him, he heard Giuseppe coughing, the wet, rattling sound of a man whose lungs were filling with fluid, whose time was running out. Marco pulled out his phone and saw that he had no signal out here, no way to call Vincent, no way to ask for guidance. He was alone with his decision, alone with the dying Consigliere and the truth that waited in the barn. He lit another cigarette and watched the sun sink below the hills, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called, its voice harsh and lonely. Marco thought about the dawn, about Vincent, about the life he had chosen, and the oaths he had sworn. He thought about Giuseppe sitting alone in his chair, holding on to secrets that could destroy dynasties. And he thought about the records waiting in the darkness of the barn, the truth that men had died to protect and others had killed to suppress. Tomorrow he would go into the barn. Tomorrow he would find what Giuseppe had hidden. But tonight, as the shadows lengthened and the farmhouse settled into silence, Marco stood on the porch and wondered if the old man was right. Wondered if, once he opened those barn doors and reached for the past, he would ever be able to close them again. Wondered if the truth, once unleashed, would burn everything he had built, everything he believed in, everything he thought he knew about loyalty and honor and the life he had chosen. Inside the house, Giuseppe sat in his chair, his eyes closed, his breath shallow. He had said what needed to be said. Now it was up to the boy to decide, to choose between the family and the truth, between power and conscience, between the man he was and the man he might become. Giuseppe had made his choice long ago, and it had cost him everything. Now, as death approached with its slow, inevitable steps, he wondered if it had been worth it, if the truth he had protected all these years would finally see the light, or if it would die with him, buried forever beneath the hay and the dust and the forgotten dreams of men who had once believed in something greater than themselves. The sun disappeared below the horizon, and darkness claimed the farm, wrapping it in shadows and silence. And in that darkness, the barn waited, its doors locked, its secrets hidden, a monument to the past and a warning to the future. Marco stood on the porch, smoking his cigarette, staring at those doors, knowing that once he crossed that threshold, once he reached for what lay inside, nothing would ever be the same. Not for him, not for the family, not for the truth that had waited 38 years to be told. The first chapter of his story was ending. The second was about to begin. And in the space between them, in the silence of the dying light, Marco felt the weight of history pressing down on him, heavy as the earth, cold as the grave, relentless as the tide that pulls all things toward the shore. He finished his cigarette and flicked it into the dirt, watching the ember glow and fade. Then he turned and walked back into the house, where Giuseppe waited in his chair, a dying ghost guarding the secrets of the dead, a forgotten man who had once held the power to reshape the world and had chosen instead to disappear into silence. And Marco knew with a certainty that settled in his bones like ice that by the time he left this farm, he would understand why. Marco woke to the sound of roosters and the pale grey light of dawn filtering through thin curtains. He had spent the night in a spare room upstairs, a cramped space that smelled of mothballs and old wood, sleeping fitfully on a mattress that sagged in the middle like a hammock. His dreams had been troubled, filled with images of locked doors and burning papers, of men in suits standing in shadows, their faces hidden, their voices whispering accusations he could not quite hear. When he finally gave up on sleep and rose, his body ached and his mind felt sluggish, weighed down by the conversation from the night before. He dressed quietly and made his way downstairs, moving carefully on the creaking steps, not wanting to disturb Giuseppe. But when he reached the living room, he found the old man already awake, sitting in his chair exactly as he had been the night before, as if he had not moved at all. The television was still on, still muted, showing the morning news with its parade of tragedies and scandals. Giuseppe's eyes were closed, but his chest rose and fell with labored breathing, each breath a struggle, each moment a battle against the inevitability that waited for him. Marco stood in the doorway watching the old man and felt something twist inside him, something uncomfortable and unfamiliar. Pity, perhaps, or guilt. He pushed the feeling aside and cleared his throat. Giuseppe's eyes opened slowly, focusing on Marco with effort. "You are still here," Giuseppe said, his voice even more hoarse than it had been the night before. "I thought maybe you would leave in the night, drive back to the city, and tell the Dawn that you found nothing, that the old man was already dead when you arrived." "I thought about it," Marco admitted. He moved into the room and sat down on the stool again, facing Giuseppe. "But I need to see what is in that barn." I need to know if what you told me is true. Giuseppe's mouth twitched in something that might have been approval. Good. Doubt is the beginning of wisdom. Blind faith is for priests and fools. He gestured weakly toward the kitchen. There is coffee in the pot, cold but still coffee. Bread in the cabinet if you are hungry. I do not eat much anymore. Food tastes like ashes. Marco went to the kitchen and found the coffee, thick and bitter and hours old, but strong enough to clear some of the fog from his mind. He drank it standing at the counter, looking out the window at the barn, its shape dark and solid against the lightening sky. The chain on the doors glinted in the dawn light, and Marco wondered how many times Giuseppe had looked at that barn over the years, knowing what it contained, carrying the weight of those secrets alone. When he returned to the living room, Giuseppe was coughing again, his body shaking with the force of it, his handkerchief pressed to his mouth. When the fit passed, he lowered the cloth, and Marco saw the dark stain on it, the unmistakable color of blood. The old man folded the handkerchief carefully and tucked it into his pocket, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he had done this many times before and knew the routine by heart. How long? Marco asked quietly. How long do you have? Giuseppe shrugged, a gesture that seemed to take enormous effort. Days, maybe. A week if I'm unlucky. The doctor in town says it is my lungs. Cancer, spreading like wildfire. He wanted me to go to the hospital to try treatments. I told him no. I have lived long enough, longer than I deserved maybe. When death comes, I will meet it here, in this place where I chose to hide from the world. Marco sat down again, studying the old man's face, the deep lines carved by time and regret, the pale eyes that had seen too much and carried too many secrets. Why did you never destroy the records? If they were so dangerous, if keeping them put you at risk, why keep them at all? Giuseppe was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant, fixed on something Marco could not see. When he spoke, his voice was soft, almost reverent. Because I owed them that much. The men who died because of Salvatore's betrayal. They deserved to have their story told, to have someone remember what really happened. I kept the records as a testimony, as proof that they existed, that they mattered, that they were not just names on a list or bodies in the ground. I kept them because someone had to bear witness to the truth. And now, Marco asked, what do you want me to do with them? Giuseppe turned his gaze to Marco, and for the first time there was something like hope in his eyes, fragile and desperate. That is your choice, not mine. I have done what I could. I have kept them safe, kept them hidden. But I am dying, and when I am gone, those records will be alone in that barn, waiting for someone to find them. It could be you. It could be someone else. It could be no one, and they could rot there until the barn collapses and the earth claims them. I cannot control what happens next. All I can do is tell you what they contain and let you decide what kind of man you want to be. Marco felt a surge of frustration, a need for clear answers, for simple choices. You keep talking about choices, about what kind of man I want to be, but you are not giving me anything to work with. You tell me the Don's grandfather was a traitor, that these records contain proof of his crimes, but you do not tell me what to do with that information. Do you want me to expose it, to destroy the family, to protect it? What do you want from me? Giuseppe's laugh was bitter, tinged with sadness. I want nothing from you, boy. I am past wanting, but if you are asking what I would do if I were in your place, I will tell you. I would read the records. I would know the truth, the whole truth, not just the pieces that serve my interests or protect my position. And then I would ask myself a question. Do I serve the family because it is right, or because it is convenient? Do I follow orders because I believe in the code, or because I am afraid of what will happen if I do not? And if the answer is fear, if the answer is convenience, then I would walk away, because a life built on lies and fear is no life at all. It is just a slow death, a surrender to the darkness that consumes us all in the end. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of a lifetime of regret. Marco stood abruptly, needing to move, needing to act. I am going to the barn. Where is the key to the chain? Giuseppe reached into his pocket with trembling fingers and pulled out a small brass key, worn smooth by years of handling. He held it out to Marco, and when Marco took it, their hands touched for a moment, the old man's skin cold and papery, the young man's warm and alive. The records are in a metal trunk, buried under the hay in the northwest corner. You will need a shovel. There is one hanging on the wall near the door. When you find the trunk, bring it here. We will go through it together, and I will tell you the story behind each document, each name, each betrayal. You deserve to know what you are taking back to the Don. Marco nodded and turned to leave, but Giuseppe's voice stopped him. Marco, one more thing. When you go into that barn, when you start digging through the past, remember this. The truth is not clean. It is not simple. It is messy and complicated and full of contradictions. Men are not heroes or villains. They are both and neither, and everything in between. Salvatore was a great man in many ways. He built an empire, protected his people, gave order to chaos, but he was also a traitor and a murderer, willing to sacrifice his brothers for his own ambition. Do not make the mistake of thinking the truth will give you easy answers. It will only give you questions, harder and more painful than the ones you started with. Marco said nothing. He walked out of the house and across the yard, the key clutched in his hand, the morning sun warm on his face. The chickens scattered at his approach, clucking indignantly, and the cow watched him with its dull, incurious eyes. He reached the barn and stood before the doors, the chain heavy and solid, the lock old but functional. He inserted the key and turned it, feeling the mechanism give with a satisfying click. The chain fell away, and Marco pulled open the doors, the hinges groaning in protest, the smell of hay and dust and animal musk rolling out to meet him. Inside the barn was dim, lit only by the shafts of sunlight that streamed through gaps in the walls and the spaces between the roof boards. Dust motes danced in the light, and Marco could hear the rustle of small creatures in the shadows, mice or rats, going about their secret business. The floor was covered in hay piled high in some places, scattered thin in others. Farm equipment leaned against the walls, rusted and broken, relics of a time when this place had been a working farm. A ladder led up to a loft, and Marco could see more hay up there, bales stacked in neat rows undisturbed for years. He found the shovel where Giuseppe had said it would be, and made his way to the northwest corner of the barn. The hay here was deep, and as Marco began to dig, throwing aside armfuls of dry, brittle stalks, he realized how much work Giuseppe must have done to bury the trunk, how much effort it must have taken to hide it so thoroughly. The old man had not just thrown the trunk into the barn and covered it with a few handfuls of hay. He had created a grave for it, a secret place where it could rest undisturbed, waiting for the day when someone would come looking. Marco dug for 20 minutes, his suit jacket discarded, his shirt soaked with sweat, his hands blistered from the rough handle of the shovel, and then, finally, his blade struck something solid, the dull clang of metal on metal. He dropped the shovel and used his hands to clear away the remaining hay, revealing the trunk beneath. It was old, military surplus by the look of it, olive green and dented, with a heavy padlock securing the lid. Marco lifted it with effort, grunting as he carried it toward the doors, his arms straining under the weight. It was not just documents inside, he realized. There was something else, something heavy that shifted as he moved. He carried the trunk across the yard and into the house, setting it down on the floor in front of Giuseppe's chair. The old man looked at it with an expression Marco could not quite read, a mixture of sadness and relief, as if he were greeting an old friend he had not seen in many years. Giuseppe reached down and ran his hand over the surface of the trunk, his fingers tracing the dents and scratches, the marks of time and memory. "Open it," Giuseppe said softly. "The lock is just for show. It has not been locked in years. I just kept it on to make it look like it mattered." Marco knelt and lifted the padlock, which came away easily, the hasp rusted and loose. He opened the lid slowly, the hinges protesting, and stared at what lay inside. Documents, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, organized in folders and bound with rubber bands that had long since lost their elasticity. Photographs black and white, showing men in suits and hats standing in front of buildings Marco recognized from the old neighborhood, their faces serious, their eyes hard. And beneath the documents, at the bottom of the trunk, something wrapped in oilcloth, rectangular and heavy. Giuseppe leaned forward, his breath wheezing, and pointed to one of the folders. "Start with that one, the red folder. That is where it begins. That is the proof of what Salvatore did." Marco lifted the folder carefully and opened it. Inside were letters, typewritten on yellowed paper, dated 1986 and 1987. He began to read, and as the words registered, as the meaning sank in, he felt a cold shock run through him, a sense of disbelief that gave way slowly to a sick certainty. The letters were from Don Salvatore Lombardi to Angelo Russo, the underboss of the Colombo family. They discussed a meeting, a negotiation, a deal. Salvatore would provide the names and locations of 3 of his own men, loyal capos, who controlled key territories. In exchange, Angelo would arrange for their elimination and split the territories with Salvatore, giving the Lombardi family access to drug routes in Miami and Los Angeles. The letters were detailed, specific, laying out the terms with the cold precision of a business contract, and at the bottom of each letter was Salvatore's signature, bold and unmistakable. Marco looked up at Giuseppe, his hands shaking. "These are real. This is his handwriting." "It is real," Giuseppe confirmed. "I found those letters in his office safe, along with the others. He kept them as insurance, as proof that the Colombo family had agreed to the deal, in case they tried to betray him. But in keeping them, he created the evidence of his own betrayal." Marco flipped through the folder, finding more letters, more documents. Meeting notes, written in Salvatore's hand, detailing the logistics of the killings. Bank statements showing payments made to Angelo Russo's accounts, coded as business expenses, but clearly bribes. Blood money. And photographs, terrible photographs, crime scene images of the three capos, their bodies broken and bloody, sprawled in alleys and parking lots, victims of what the newspapers had called a turf war with the Colombo family. But it had not been a war. It had been an execution, ordered by their own Don, carried out by men they had thought were enemies. "Who were they?" Marco asked, his voice hollow. "The three capos. Who were they?" Giuseppe closed his eyes, and when he spoke, his voice was heavy with grief. "Anthony Moretti, Vincent Catalano, Michael Giordano. Good men, loyal men. They had served Salvatore for 20 years, built the empire with him, bled for him. Anthony had 6 children. Vincent was about to retire, buy a house in Florida, spend his last years in the sun. Michael was my closest friend. We grew up together, went to school together, joined the family together. He was going to be the best man at my wedding." He opened his eyes, and Marco saw tears there, old tears, tears that had been waiting 38 years to fall. Salvatore killed them for money and power. He looked them in the eye, shook their hands, broke bread with them, and then he signed their death warrants, and no one ever knew. The family believed it was the Colombo family. They mourned and they swore vengeance, and they went to war. And all the while, Salvatore sat in his office counting his profits, planning his next move. Marco set the folder down, his mind reeling, trying to process what he had just learned. Everything he had been taught about the family, about loyalty and honor, about the code that governed their lives, felt like a lie, a story told to children to make them obey. If Don Salvatore, the legend, the foundation of the Lombardi family, could betray his own men, then what did loyalty mean? What did any of it mean? He reached into the trunk and pulled out the next folder, this one labeled with a name he recognized, Thomas Ricci, a capo who had served under Salvatore and later under his son. Marco opened the folder and found more documents, more letters, more evidence of betrayals and deals and secrets. Thomas Ricci had been an informant, feeding information to the FBI for 10 years, protected by Salvatore in exchange for eliminating rivals in other families. The arrangement had been profitable for both sides, and when Thomas had finally been exposed, Salvatore had arranged for his quiet disappearance, making it look like Thomas had fled to Mexico, when in reality he had been buried in the foundation of a building in Brooklyn. Folder after folder, document after document, the truth unfolded before Marco like a map of hell. Salvatore had not been the great Don of legend. He had been a manipulator, a liar, a man who had used the code as a weapon to control his men while violating it himself at every turn. He had made deals with the FBI, with rival families, with corrupt politicians and dirty cops. He had ordered the deaths of men who trusted him, silenced those who questioned him, and built his empire on a foundation of bones and betrayals. And Giuseppe had been there for all of it, sitting at his right hand, watching it happen, keeping the records that would one day bear witness to the truth. "Why did you stay so long?" Marco asked, looking up from the documents, his eyes burning. "If you knew what he was doing, why did you not leave sooner? Why did you wait until you found these letters?" Giuseppe's expression was bleak, haunted. "Because I was young, and I was loyal, and I believed in the code. I told myself that the things Salvatore did were necessary, that he was protecting the family, that the ends justified the means. I made excuses for him, rationalized his crimes, convinced myself that I was serving something greater than myself. And by the time I realized the truth, by the time I understood that there was no greater cause, that it was all just greed and ambition, I was already complicit. I had helped him, advised him, executed his orders. I was as guilty as he was. "So you ran," Marco said, and there was no judgment in his voice, only exhaustion. "I ran," Giuseppe agreed, "and I took these records with me, and I hid them here, and I spent the rest of my life trying to live with what I had done, trying to find some way to make it right, some way to atone. But atonement is a luxury for men who have time. I am out of time." Marco reached into the trunk one more time and pulled out the oilcloth bundle. He unwrapped it carefully, and inside he found a revolver, old and well-maintained, its steel gleaming dully in the light. Beside it was a small leather journal bound with a strap. Marco opened the journal and saw handwriting, Giuseppe's handwriting, page after page of entries, dated from 1987 to the present, a chronicle of his exile, his thoughts, his regrets, and on the first page, written in bold letters, "For whoever finds this, the truth does not die, it only waits." Marco closed the journal and looked at Giuseppe, who was watching him with those pale, tired eyes. "What do you want me to do with all of this?" Giuseppe smiled, a sad, weary smile. "I told you, boy. That is your choice. You can take it back to the Don. You can use it to gain favor, to rise in the family, to prove your loyalty, or you can destroy it. Burn the documents, bury the truth, let the past stay buried. Or you can do something else, something I could never bring myself to do. You can let the truth out. You can show the world what the Lombardi family really is, what it was built on. You can tear down the empire and watch it burn." "And what would that accomplish?" Marco demanded, his voice rising. "What good would it do? It would destroy the family, destroy the lives of everyone connected to it. It would bring chaos and bloodshed. For what? Justice for men who have been dead for 40 years. Justice is not about the dead," Giuseppe said quietly. "It is about the living. It is about making sure that the lies and the betrayals and the crimes do not continue, that they do not get passed down from generation to generation like some cursed inheritance. It is about breaking the cycle, about choosing something different, something better. But that is easy for me to say. I chose safety, I chose silence. You have to choose for yourself." Marco stood and walked to the window, looking out at the fields, at the sun climbing higher in the sky, burning away the morning mist. He thought about Don Anthony, about Vincent Carbone, about the life he had built in the family, the respect he had earned, the future he had planned. He thought about the code, about loyalty and honor, about the oaths he had sworn. And he thought about the men in those folders, the men who had trusted and been betrayed, the men who had died believing in something that had never been real. He turned back to Giuseppe and saw that the old man had closed his eyes again, his breathing shallow, his face pale and drawn. Time was running out, for Giuseppe and for Marco's decision. Soon the old man would be gone, and Marco would be alone with the truth, alone with the weight of history, alone with the choice that would define the rest of his life. "I need time," Marco said finally. "I need to think about this." Giuseppe opened his eyes one last time and nodded. "Take all the time you need, but remember, boy, time is not unlimited. It runs out for all of us, and when it does, all that is left is what we chose to do and who we chose to be." Marco gathered the folders and placed them back in the trunk, closing the lid carefully. He carried the trunk upstairs to the spare room and hid it under the bed, out of sight but not out of mind. Then he went outside and stood in the yard, breathing the clean air, feeling the sun on his face, trying to clear his head, trying to find some sense of clarity in the chaos of his thoughts. But clarity did not come. There were only questions, endless questions, and the terrible certainty that whatever he decided, whatever path he chose, it would cost him something he could never get back. His innocence, perhaps, his faith in the family, his sense of who he was and what he believed in. Or maybe something deeper, something more fundamental, his soul. Inside the house, Giuseppe sat in his chair, waiting for death with the patience of a man who had been waiting for a long time. And in the barn, the hay lay scattered where Marco had dug, marking the grave that had held the truth for 38 years, the testimony of the dead, the judgment of the past. And the day wore on, slow and heavy, as Marco walked the fields and wrestled with his conscience, and the farm held its breath, waiting to see what the young soldier would choose, and whether the truth, after all these years, would finally find its way into the light. 3 days passed at the farm, 3 days that felt like 3 lifetimes. Marco spent them in a kind of purgatory, trapped between worlds, unable to commit to the life he had known, and unable to embrace the truth that Giuseppe had shown him. He read the documents over and over, memorizing names and dates, studying the photographs until the faces of the dead men haunted his dreams. He walked the fields, trying to think, trying to find some angle he had missed, some way to reconcile what he had learned with what he believed. But there was no reconciliation to be found. The truth was the truth, stark and unforgiving, and it demanded a response. Giuseppe grew weaker each day. He ate nothing, drank only water, and spent most of his time sleeping in the chair, his breathing increasingly labored, his skin taking on the grey pallor of approaching death. Marco helped him to the bathroom when needed, brought him water, adjusted the blankets when he shivered despite the warmth of the day. They spoke little. There was nothing left to say. Giuseppe had given his testimony, and now he was waiting for the end, patient and resigned, like a man who had been carrying a heavy burden for so long that putting it down felt like a kind of grace. On the morning of the fourth day, Marco's phone buzzed. He had driven into town the previous afternoon to get a signal, to check his messages, and now the missed calls and texts came flooding in. 12 missed calls from Vincent Carbone, 8 from other soldiers in the crew, 3 from a number he did not recognize, and a single text from Vincent, sent late last night. "Call me immediately. The Don is asking questions." Marco stood on the porch, the phone in his hand, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He could ignore the call, stay here at the farm, wait until Giuseppe died and then disappear, take the documents and vanish the way Giuseppe had vanished all those years ago. Or he could call Vincent, report in, tell him what he had found, and let the family decide what to do with the truth. Or he could do something else entirely, something that terrified him more than either of those options. He could use the documents, leverage them, play the game the way Don Salvatore had played it, using secrets as weapons, truth as currency. He lit a cigarette and dialed Vincent's number. The capo answered on the first ring. "Where the hell have you been?" Vincent's voice was tight with anger and something else, something that sounded like fear. "I have been calling you for 3 days. The Don wants a report. He wants to know what you found." "I found him," Marco said, keeping his voice steady. "Giuseppe Mancini, he is here at a farm about 2 hours outside the city. He is dying. Cancer. He has maybe a few days left." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Marco could hear Vincent breathing, could almost see him processing the information, calculating the implications. "And the records? Did you find them?" Marco hesitated, and in that hesitation, he felt the moment crystallize, the choice becoming real. "Yes. I found them. They were hidden in the barn just like we thought. But Vincent, you need to understand something. These are not just account numbers and business records. These are documents that could destroy the family. They contain evidence of things that Don Salvatore did, things that go against everything we claim to stand for." "What things?" Vincent's voice was sharp now, dangerous. "What are you talking about?" Marco took a breath and made his choice. Not the final choice, not yet, but a step toward it. "I cannot explain over the phone. You need to come here. You need to see for yourself. This is bigger than a retrieval job, Vincent. This is about the foundation of the family, about who we are and what we have been built on. And you need to decide what to do with that information before we bring it to the Don." Another pause, longer this time. Marco could hear muffled voices in the background, could imagine Vincent standing in the social club, surrounded by other members of the crew, all of them listening, all of them wondering what Marco had found that had him talking like this. Finally, Vincent spoke, his voice cold and controlled. "Give me the address. I will be there by tonight. And Marco, listen to me very carefully. Do not do anything stupid. Do not make any decisions on your own. You wait for me. You hear? You wait." "I hear you," Marco said. He gave Vincent the address and ended the call, then stood on the porch smoking his cigarette, watching the sun climb higher in the sky. He had bought himself time, a few more hours to think, to prepare. But he had also set events in motion that he could not stop. Vincent was coming, and with him, the weight of the family's expectations, the pressure of loyalty and obligation. And once Vincent saw the documents, once he understood what they contained, there would be no going back. The truth would be out in the open, and someone would have to decide what to do with it. Marco went inside and found Giuseppe awake, his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. "You called them," the old man said. It was not a question. "I called Vincent Carbone. He is coming here tonight. He wants to see the documents." Giuseppe nodded slowly, as if he had expected this. "And what will you tell him?" "I do not know yet," Marco admitted. He sat down on the stool facing Giuseppe. "Part of me wants to show him everything. Let him see what Don Salvatore really was, force him to confront the truth. But another part of me knows that the moment I do that, the moment I reveal those documents to anyone in the family, I am signing my own death warrant, because they will not thank me for exposing their legends as lies. They will see me as a threat, as someone who knows too much, who cannot be trusted to keep silent. You are right, Giuseppe said quietly. They will kill you. Not immediately, not openly, but they will find a reason, manufacture some excuse, and you will disappear just like I did. The difference is you will not have the chance to hide. They know where you are, who you are, where your family lives. You have no leverage, no protection. Only the truth, and the truth has never been enough to save anyone in this life. Marco felt a chill run through him, the cold certainty of his own mortality. Then what do I do? Run? Take the documents and disappear? Spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, waiting for the day when they find me? Giuseppe was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful, almost musing. There is a third option, one I never had the courage to take. You could use the documents not as a weapon against the family, but as insurance. You could make copies, hide them in multiple places, and let the family know that if anything happens to you, if you disappear or have an accident, those copies will be sent to the FBI, to the newspapers, to every rival family on the East Coast. You could turn the truth into a shield instead of a sword. Marco stared at him, his mind racing. You mean blackmail? Blackmail the family into letting me live? I mean survival, Giuseppe corrected. In this life, you do what you must to stay alive. Loyalty is a luxury for men who have power. For men like you and me, for men who know too much and have too little, survival is the only code that matters. And you think that would work? You think the Don would let me walk around with that kind of leverage? Giuseppe's smile was grim. He would have no choice. If he kills you, the truth comes out. If he lets you live, he maintains control, maintains the illusion. Powerful men are pragmatic, Marco. They understand that sometimes the best way to neutralize a threat is not to eliminate it, but to contain it. You become a secret that everyone knows, but no one speaks of. A living reminder of the price of ambition and the cost of betrayal. Marco stood and walked to the window, looking out at the yard, at the barn where the truth had waited for so long. He thought about what Giuseppe was suggesting, about the life it would mean. Always watched, always suspect, never fully trusted, never fully safe. A soldier who could never rise, never advance, forever trapped in the lower ranks because he knew too much and had made himself too dangerous to promote. It was not the life he had imagined when he joined the family, not the future he had planned, but it was life, and that was more than most men got when they stumbled onto secrets like these. I need to make copies, Marco said finally. Before Vincent gets here, I need to photograph every document, every letter, every photograph, and I need to hide those copies somewhere safe, somewhere the family will never find them. Giuseppe nodded. There is a camera in the drawer of the table beside my chair. Old, but it still works. And there is a laptop in the closet upstairs. I do not know if it still has power, but you can try. Take pictures of everything. Store them on the computer, on thumb drives, in the cloud if you know how. Make it impossible for them to destroy all the evidence. Marco spent the next 6 hours working methodically through the trunk, photographing each document with the old camera and with his phone, uploading the images to encrypted cloud storage, copying them to 3 different thumb drives that he found in a drawer in the kitchen. He worked with a kind of desperate focus, knowing that once Vincent arrived, there would be no more chances, no more opportunities to secure the evidence. This was his insurance policy, his guarantee of survival, and he could not afford to make mistakes. By the time he finished, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, the light fading into the deep purple of dusk. Marco hid 2 of the thumb drives in different locations, one buried in the yard beneath a fence post, the other taped to the underside of the kitchen sink. The third he kept in his pocket, along with a handwritten note he had prepared, sealed in an envelope addressed to a lawyer he knew in the city, a man who owed him a favor and could be trusted to follow instructions. If Marco did not check in within a week, the note instructed, the lawyer was to open the envelope and follow the directions inside, which would lead him to the cloud storage and the other thumb drives. It was not a perfect plan, but it was the best Marco could manage with the time and resources he had. As darkness fell, Marco saw headlights on the road, a car approaching slowly, carefully, feeling its way through the ruts and stones. Vincent had arrived. Marco went to the porch and watched as the car, A dark Mercedes pulled into the yard and stopped. The engine cut off and Vincent Carbone stepped out, followed by two other men, soldiers Marco recognized from the crew. They were armed. Marco could tell from the way their jackets hung, from the way they moved, alert and ready. Vincent himself was a compact man in his 50s, with graying hair and cold, intelligent eyes. A man who had survived 30 years in the family by being smart, ruthless, and loyal in that order. Vincent walked up to the porch, his eyes scanning Marco, reading him. "You look like hell," he said without preamble. "4 days out here, and you look like you have aged 10 years. What did you find that has you so rattled?" "Come inside," Marco said. "I will show you." They went into the house, Vincent and his two soldiers, their presence filling the small space, making it feel crowded and dangerous. Giuseppe was in his chair, eyes closed, breathing shallow, looking more dead than alive. Vincent glanced at him, his expression unreadable, then turned his attention to Marco. "Where are the records?" Marco went upstairs and brought down the trunk, setting it on the floor in front of Vincent. He opened it, revealing the folders and documents inside. Vincent knelt and began to go through them, his face impassive, his movements efficient. He read the letters from Don Salvatore, studied the photographs, examined the meeting notes and bank statements. The two soldiers stood behind him, watching Marco, their hands resting near their weapons, ready to act if needed. The silence stretched out, broken only by the rustling of papers and Giuseppe's labored breathing. Marco stood by the window, his heart pounding, his hand in his pocket, fingers touching the thumb drive, his insurance, his lifeline. Finally, Vincent looked up, his face still expressionless, but Marco could see something in his eyes, something dangerous and calculating. "This is real," Vincent said, not a question but a statement. "This is proof that Don Salvatore betrayed his own men, that he made deals with the FBI, that he built the family on lies and murder." "It is real," Marco confirmed. "Giuseppe kept these records for 38 years. He was Salvatore's Consigliere. He was there for all of it. And now he is dying, and he wanted someone to know the truth." Vincent stood slowly, his gaze shifting to Giuseppe, who had opened his eyes and was watching them with a kind of detached curiosity, as if this were all happening to someone else. "You are Giuseppe Mancini," Vincent said. "The ghost, the legend. We thought you were dead." "I am dying," Giuseppe rasped. "Close enough." Vincent turned back to Marco. "What do you want to do with this? Why did you call me here instead of just bringing it back to the Don?" Marco took a breath. This was the moment, the point of no return. "Because I needed you to see it first, because I needed someone else in the family to know what these documents contain, and because I made copies." The room went very still. Vincent's eyes narrowed and the two soldiers shifted, their hands moving closer to their weapons. "Copies," Vincent said softly, dangerously. "You made copies of documents that could destroy the family. Where are they?" "Safe," Marco said, keeping his voice steady. "Stored in multiple locations, with instructions to be released if anything happens to me. I am not trying to betray the family, Vincent. I am trying to protect myself. Because the moment I give you those documents, the moment the Don knows what they contain, I become a liability. I become a man who knows too much, and we both know what happens to men like that." Vincent studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to Marco's surprise, he laughed, a short, harsh sound. "You clever little bastard. You have been here 4 days, and you have learned more about this life than most men learn in 40 years. You are right, of course. The Don would have you killed, not because he is cruel, but because he is practical. You would be a loose end, a risk, a secret waiting to be exposed. But you have made yourself too dangerous to kill, at least too dangerous to kill easily." "So what happens now?" Marco asked. Vincent looked at the trunk, at the documents, at Giuseppe in his chair. "Now we play the game. You and I, we go to the Don together. We show him what you found. And we explain to him that you have taken precautions, that the information is secured, that killing you would accomplish nothing except to guarantee its release. We make him understand that the best option, the only option, is to let you live, to keep you close, to make sure you stay loyal, and in exchange you do your job, you follow orders, you keep your mouth shut, and you never, ever threaten to use those copies unless your life is in immediate danger." "And you think he will agree to that?" Vincent shrugged. "Don Anthony is a smart man. He understands leverage. He understands that sometimes you have to make deals you do not like in order to protect what you have built. He will not be happy about it. He will probably never fully trust you again. But he will let you live because the alternative is worse." Marco felt a weight lift from his shoulders, not entirely, but enough to let him breathe. Vincent was not going to kill him. At least not yet. The plan might work. He might survive this. What about Giuseppe? What happens to him? Vincent glanced at the old man, who was watching them with those pale, tired eyes. Giuseppe is already dead. He just has not stopped breathing yet. When he does, we bury him here on his farm, quiet and anonymous. No one needs to know he was found. No one needs to know he existed. He gets his peace, his silence. That is more than most men in this life ever get. Giuseppe smiled, a faint, sad smile. I accept those terms. Bury me in the field behind the barn. There is a spot under an old oak tree. I used to sit there in the evenings watching the sun set. It is a good place to rest. Vincent nodded. It will be done. He turned back to Marco. Pack up the trunk. We leave in an hour. We drive back to the city tonight, and tomorrow morning we meet with the Don. And Marco, understand this. You have made a very dangerous play. You have bet your life on the hope that the Don will be reasonable, that he will see the value in keeping you alive. I think you are right. I think he will. But if you are wrong, if you have misjudged him, then you and I both will pay the price. Because I am vouching for you now. I am bringing you to the Don and recommending that he make a deal. If you betray that trust, if you ever use those copies for anything other than protecting your own life, I will kill you myself. Is that clear? It is clear, Marco said. They spent the next hour preparing to leave. Marco carried the trunk to Vincent's car and loaded it into the trunk. The two soldiers searched the house, looking for any additional documents, any evidence that might have been missed. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. Everything important was in the trunk or in Marco's encrypted files, beyond their reach. When they were done, Vincent stood on the porch, looking at Giuseppe one last time. Any final words, old man? Vincent asked. Any message you want delivered? Giuseppe shook his head. No messages, no farewells. I said what I needed to say. Now I am ready to be silent. Vincent nodded and walked to the car. Marco hesitated, looking back at Giuseppe, at the dying Consigliere, who had given him the truth and the tools to survive it. Thank you, Marco said quietly, for trusting me, for giving me a choice. Giuseppe's smile was gentle, almost fatherly. You made your own choice, boy. I just showed you the options. What you do with them from here is up to you. But remember what I told you. The truth is not clean. It is not simple. And once you start carrying it, you can never put it down. It will be with you for the rest of your life. A weight and a burden. Make sure you are strong enough to bear it. I will try, Marco said. That is all any of us can do, Giuseppe replied. His eyes drifted closed and his breathing slowed, each breath a struggle, each moment a victory. Marco turned and walked to the car, climbing into the back seat. Vincent started the engine, and they drove away, the farmhouse receding in the rearview mirror, swallowed by darkness. Behind them, Giuseppe sat alone in his chair, waiting for death with the patience of a man who had been waiting for a very long time, a ghost finally ready to fade into silence, a keeper of secrets finally ready to rest. The drive back to the city took 2 hours, and Marco spent them in silence, staring out the window at the passing landscape, at the lights of small towns and the dark shapes of forests and fields. He thought about what lay ahead, about the meeting with the Don, about the life he would live from this point forward, marked and watched and never fully trusted. He thought about Giuseppe, dying alone in that farmhouse, his secrets finally told, his burden finally lifted. And he thought about the truth, the terrible, complicated truth that he now carried, and wondered if he was strong enough to bear it, or if it would crush him in the end, the way it had crushed so many others who had tried to live with the weight of knowing too much. When they reached the city, Vincent drove to a safe house in Brooklyn, a nondescript apartment in a building owned by the family. We stay here tonight, Vincent said. Tomorrow morning, we go to the Don. Get some sleep. You are going to need it. Marco went to the small bedroom and lay down on the bed, still dressed, his hand in his pocket, fingers touching the thumb drive. He did not sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the city outside, the sirens and the traffic and the distant murmur of voices. And he thought about Giuseppe's words, about choices and consequences, about the price of truth and the cost of survival. Somewhere in the darkness, in a farmhouse far from the city, Giuseppe took his last breath, his body finally surrendering to the cancer that had been consuming him from within. He died alone, as he had lived for 38 years, a ghost fading into silence, a secret finally laid to rest. And in the morning, when Vincent's men returned to the farm to bury him, They found him still sitting in his chair, his eyes closed, his face peaceful, as if he had simply fallen asleep and decided not to wake up. They buried him under the oak tree behind the barn as he had requested, in a grave without a marker, anonymous and forgotten. One more forgotten man in a world full of forgotten men. But the truth he had kept, the testimony he had preserved, lived on, carried by a young soldier who had stumbled into history and made a choice that would define the rest of his life. The records were no longer buried in a barn. They were encrypted in the cloud, hidden in thumb drives, secured in locations scattered across the city. The truth had escaped its grave, and now it walked among the living, a ghost of its own, waiting to see what would happen next, waiting to see if justice, after all these years, would finally find its way into the light. The morning came grey and cold, the sky heavy with clouds that promised rain but never delivered. Marco woke early, his body stiff from a night spent lying awake, his mind churning through scenarios and strategies, trying to anticipate every possible outcome of the meeting ahead. He showered in the small bathroom, dressed in a fresh suit that Vincent had provided, and stood before the mirror studying his reflection. He looked older than he had 4 days ago, the lines around his eyes deeper, his expression harder. The farm had changed him, or maybe it had just revealed something that had always been there, waiting beneath the surface, a capacity for survival, for ruthlessness, for doing what needed to be done regardless of the cost. Vincent was waiting in the kitchen, drinking coffee and reading the newspaper, a picture of casual normalcy that did not match the tension in the air. The 2 soldiers from the night before sat at the table, cleaning their weapons with practiced efficiency, the smell of gun oil mixing with the coffee. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. Everyone knew what was coming, and words would not change it. At 9 o'clock, they left the safe house and drove to the Don's estate in Westchester, a sprawling property surrounded by high walls and iron gates, the kind of place that spoke of old money and older power. The guards at the gate waved them through without question, recognizing Vincent's car, and they drove up a long driveway lined with oak trees, their branches bare and skeletal against the grey sky. The mansion itself was a study in understated elegance, brick and stone and tall windows, the architecture speaking of tradition and permanence, of a family that had been here for generations and intended to stay. Vincent parked near the front entrance and they walked inside, through a foyer with marble floors and a crystal chandelier, past paintings of stern-faced men in old-fashioned suits, ancestors and legends, the ghosts of the family's history. A butler, old and dignified, led them through the house to a study at the back, a large room panelled in dark wood, lined with bookshelves, dominated by a massive desk behind which sat Don Anthony Lombardi. The Don was 53 years old, a tall man with silver hair and sharp features, dressed in an expensive suit that fit him like a second skin. He had his grandfather's eyes, Marco noticed, the same cold intelligence, the same ability to look at a man and see through him, to strip away the masks and the lies and find the truth underneath. But where Salvatore had been a force of nature, unpredictable and terrifying, Anthony was controlled, calculated, a man who had learned from his grandfather's mistakes and refined the art of power into something more subtle, more sustainable. He looked up as they entered, his expression neutral, revealing nothing. "Vincent, Marco, please, sit." He gestured to the chairs arranged in front of his desk. Vincent sat immediately, and Marco followed, the metal trunk resting on the floor between them, a silent presence that seemed to fill the room with its weight. The 2 soldiers remained standing by the door, watching, waiting. The Don leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him, studying Marco with the intensity of a scientist examining a specimen. "You have been gone for 4 days. Vincent tells me you found Giuseppe Mancini and recovered the records we were looking for. He also tells me there are complications. Explain." Marco felt his mouth go dry, but he kept his voice steady. "I found Giuseppe at a farm 2 hours outside the city. He was dying cancer. He had maybe days left. He told me where the records were hidden, and I retrieved them. But when I looked through them, I realized they were not just business records or account numbers. They were evidence, proof of things that your grandfather did, things that would damage the family if they ever became public." "What things?" The Don's voice was soft, dangerous. Marco glanced at Vincent, who nodded slightly, giving him permission to continue. "Proof that Don Salvatore betrayed 3 of his own capos in 1987. He made a deal with the Colombo family to have them killed in exchange for access to drug routes in Miami and Los Angeles. He kept letters, meeting notes, bank statements, photographs, all of it documenting the betrayal in detail. The Don's expression did not change, but Marco saw his jaw tighten, saw a flicker of something cross his eyes, there and gone too quickly to identify. Anger, perhaps, or fear. "Show me." Vincent opened the trunk and began to lay out the folders on the desk, organizing them carefully, creating a timeline of betrayal. The Don read in silence, his face impassive, his movements methodical. He studied each letter, each photograph, each piece of evidence, and Marco watched him, trying to read him, trying to anticipate his reaction. But the Don gave nothing away. He was a master of control, a man who had learned long ago that emotion was a weakness, and that power came from the ability to remain calm no matter what storm was raging inside. When he finished, the Don looked up, his gaze moving from the documents to Marco. "Giuseppe kept these for 38 years. He could have destroyed them. He could have used them to destroy my grandfather, to tear apart the family. But he did neither. He simply disappeared and took them with him. Why? He said he kept them as testimony," Marco replied, "as proof that the men who died mattered, that their story deserved to be told. He said the truth does not die just because you bury it. It only waits." The Don nodded slowly, as if Marco had confirmed something he already suspected. "And now the truth has been uncovered. The question is, what do we do with it? What do you propose, Marco?" This was the moment. Marco took a breath and made his play. "I propose we keep it buried. We lock these documents away, make sure they never see the light of day. The men who died are long gone. Exposing what happened to them now would not bring them back. It would only damage the family, create chaos, undermine everything we have built. But I also propose we acknowledge what these documents are. They are a warning, a reminder that power without accountability is dangerous, that betrayal corrupts everything it touches. And I propose that I be allowed to live despite knowing what I now know." The Don's eyes narrowed. "You are asking for protection? For your life to be spared even though you have knowledge that makes you a threat to the family?" "Yes," Marco said simply. "I am, and to ensure my safety, I have taken precautions. I made copies of all the documents. I stored them in multiple secure locations with instructions for their release if anything happens to me. I am not threatening the family, Don Anthony. I am protecting myself, because I know how this life works. I know what happens to men who learn too much." The silence that followed was absolute. The Don stared at Marco, his expression unreadable, and Marco felt the weight of that gaze, felt the moment stretching out, felt his fate hanging in the balance. Then slowly the Don smiled. It was not a warm smile, not friendly or reassuring. It was the smile of a predator who has just realized his prey is more interesting than he expected. "You have nerve," the Don said quietly. "I will give you that. Most men in your position would have run or tried to bargain or begged for mercy. But you came here, laid out your cards and asked for a deal. That takes courage or stupidity, and I am not yet sure which." "It takes survival," Marco said. "That is all. I want to live. I want to continue serving the family. But I need to know that my life is not going to end the moment I leave this room." The Don leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk, his eyes locked on Marco's. "Let me tell you something about power, Marco. Real power is not about violence or fear or the ability to destroy your enemies. Real power is about control. It is about managing threats, neutralizing risks, turning weaknesses into strengths. You have made yourself a threat by acquiring this knowledge, but you have also made yourself useful by demonstrating your intelligence and your loyalty. The question I have to answer is whether your usefulness outweighs your threat, whether keeping you alive serves the family better than eliminating you." "And what is your answer?" Marco asked, his voice steady despite the fear coiling in his gut. The Don sat back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "My answer is that you live, but not because I am afraid of your copies or because I believe you will release them if I kill you. I could find those copies if I wanted to. I could hunt down every thumb drive, every cloud account, every lawyer you have given instructions to. It would take time and resources, but it could be done. No, you live because I choose to let you live, because I see in you a quality that is rare in this life. You are smart, adaptable, and you understand the game. You have potential, Marco, and I would rather have that potential working for me than wasted." Marco felt a rush of relief so intense it was almost dizzying. He had survived. The gamble had paid off, but before he could fully process the emotion, the Don continued, his voice harder now, edged with warning. "But understand this. Your life is mine from this moment forward. You belong to me, body and soul. You will do what I tell you to do, go where I tell you to go, and you will never ever question my orders. You will keep your mouth shut about what you know. You will not speak of it to anyone, not to your friends, not to your family, not to the other soldiers. You will bury it as deep as Giuseppe buried those documents, and you will leave it there. And if I ever suspect that you are using that knowledge against me, if I hear even a whisper that you have shared those documents or threaten to release them, I will not kill you quickly. I will make you suffer. I will destroy everyone you care about, everyone you have ever loved, and I will make sure you watch before I finally let you die. Do we understand each other? Marco met the Don's eyes and saw the truth there, the absolute certainty that he meant every word. We understand each other. Good. The Don relaxed slightly, the tension in the room easing but not disappearing. Now let us talk about what happens next. These documents cannot stay in that trunk. They need to be secured properly, locked away where only I can access them. Vincent, arrange for a secure location. A safe deposit box, perhaps, under a name that cannot be traced. And make sure the contents are catalogued. I want to know exactly what we have. Every letter, every photograph, every piece of evidence. Vincent nodded. It will be done, Don Anthony. The Don turned his attention back to Marco. As for you, Marco, you will continue to work for the family. But your role is going to change. You are too valuable now to waste on street-level work, and too dangerous to keep in positions where you might be exposed to other secrets. I am going to assign you to Vincent's crew, but with a specific focus. You will become my archivist, my keeper of records. You will organize the family's history, document our operations, maintain the files that we need for reference and leverage. It is not glamorous work, but it is important. And it will keep you close, where I can watch you, where I can make sure you stay loyal. Marco understood what he was being told. He was being given a leash, a position that came with privilege and protection, but also constant supervision. He would never be trusted completely, never be allowed to rise too high or wander too far from the Don's sight. It was a cage, gilded and comfortable, but a cage nonetheless. But it was better than death, better than running, better than any of the alternatives he had considered. I accept, Marco said, and I will serve you faithfully, Don Anthony. You have my word. Your word, the Don repeated, and there was something almost sad in his tone, as if he were remembering a time when words had meant something more than they did now. Your word is only as good as your fear, Marco. Remember that. Loyalty is not about love or respect or honor. It is about understanding that betrayal has consequences, and that those consequences are worse than anything you can imagine. He stood, signaling that the meeting was over. Vincent and Marco rose as well, and the Don came around the desk, stopping in front of Marco. He was taller, and he used that height now, looking down at Marco with an expression that was part calculation, part curiosity. My grandfather was a great man, the Don said quietly. He built an empire from nothing, turned a neighborhood gang into a force that shaped this city and beyond. But he was also flawed, capable of terrible things in pursuit of power. I have always known that. I have always understood that the legends we tell about him are just that, legends. Simplified stories that hide the complicated truth. What you found in that barn, what Giuseppe kept all those years, it does not change who my grandfather was. It just proves what I already knew. That power corrupts, that ambition has a price, and that the men we celebrate as heroes are often the same men who do monstrous things in the shadows. He placed a hand on Marco's shoulder, a gesture that might have been paternal if not for the steel in his grip. You are carrying that truth now, Marco. You are one of the few who knows what lies beneath the legend, and that makes you dangerous, yes, but it also makes you important, because someone needs to remember. Someone needs to know the real story, the full story, so that we do not repeat the same mistakes, so that we do not become the very things we claim to oppose. He released Marco's shoulder and stepped back. Go now. Vincent will show you your new responsibilities. And Marco, welcome to the inner circle. It is not a gift, it is a burden, but it is one you have earned, whether you wanted it or not. Marco followed Vincent out of the study, through the mansion, and back to the car. They drove in silence for a long time, the weight of the meeting settling over them like a heavy blanket. Finally, Vincent spoke, his voice thoughtful. You impressed him. That is rare. Most men crumble under that kind of pressure. They beg or they break, or they try to make deals they have no power to enforce. But you stayed calm. You played the game, and you won. Did I? Marco asked. I survived, but I'm not sure that counts as winning. Vincent smiled, a thin, knowing smile. In this life, survival is the only victory that matters. Everything else is just noise. You will learn that in time. You will learn that the men who live longest are not the bravest or the strongest or the most loyal. They are the smartest, the ones who know when to push and when to yield, when to fight and when to run. You have that quality, Marco. That is why you are still breathing. They drove back to the safe house, and Vincent spent the rest of the day briefing Marco on his new role. He would have an office in one of the family's legitimate businesses, a bookkeeping firm in Queens. He would work normal hours, maintain normal cover, but his real job would be to organize and secure the family's sensitive records, to create systems for tracking operations, for documenting deals and debts and obligations. It was clerical work, mind-numbing in its tedium, but it came with access, with proximity to power, with the kind of knowledge that could be dangerous if used unwisely. Marco threw himself into the work, grateful for the distraction, for something to focus on other than the weight of what he carried. He set up secure filing systems, encrypted databases, protocols for handling sensitive information. He worked long hours, often late into the night, and slowly, gradually, he began to build a reputation as reliable, discreet, efficient. The other soldiers kept their distance, sensing that there was something different about him, something that set him apart. They did not know what he had found at the farm, did not know about the documents or the deal he had made with the Don, but they knew he had the Don's ear, and that was enough to make them wary. Weeks passed, then months. Summer gave way to fall, and the city changed with the seasons, the heat and noise fading into the crisp chill of approaching winter. Marco settled into his new life, his new role, and tried not to think about Giuseppe, tried not to remember the dying Consigliere sitting in his chair, coughing blood, speaking truths that no one wanted to hear. But the memories came anyway, unbidden, in quiet moments when his guard was down. He would be working late, organizing files, and suddenly he would see Giuseppe's face, hear his voice, rasping and raw. The truth does not die, it only waits. And Marco wondered what he was waiting for. Wondered if the truth he carried would ever find its way into the light, or if it would stay buried, locked away in secure locations, a secret known but never spoken. He wondered if he had done the right thing, if survival had been worth the cost, if living with the weight of knowledge was better than the alternative. There were no easy answers, no clear signs to guide him. There was only the work, the routine, the endless cycle of days that blurred together into something that resembled a life. One evening, 6 months after the meeting with the Don, Marco received a phone call. It was Vincent, his voice tight with urgency. "We have a situation. The Colombo family is asking questions about the old days, about Salvatore's deals with Angelo Russo. Someone is digging into the past, trying to find dirt. The Don wants to meet with you. Tonight. He needs to know if there is anything in the records that could connect him to his grandfather's actions." Marco felt a chill run through him. This was what he had feared, what he had known would come eventually. The past was not dead. It was never dead. It was just sleeping, waiting for someone to wake it. "I will be there," he said, and ended the call. He drove to the Don's estate, his mind racing, trying to think through every possible angle, every way this could go wrong. The records he had secured, the copies he had made, they were his insurance, his guarantee of safety, but they were also evidence, proof of crimes that could be used against the family if they fell into the wrong hands. And now, someone was asking questions, digging into old secrets, threatening to expose what had been buried for so long. The Don was waiting in his study when Marco arrived, pacing in front of the fireplace, a glass of whiskey in his hand. Vincent was there too, along with 2 other capos, older men who had served under Salvatore, who remembered the old days. They looked at Marco with suspicion, with distrust, and he knew they were wondering if he was the leak, if he had betrayed the family. "Sit down," the Don said. His voice clipped. Marco sat, and the Don turned to face him, his expression grim. "The Colombo family has a new underboss, a man named Dante Russo, Angelo Russo's grandson. He is asking questions about his grandfather's death, about the deals he made, about why he disappeared in 1989. He is looking for answers, and he is getting close to things we do not want exposed. I need to know what is in those records, Marco. I need to know if there is anything that connects my grandfather to Angelo's death." Marco thought carefully before answering. He had read every document, memorized every detail. He knew what was there and what was not. There are letters between your grandfather and Angelo discussing the deal to eliminate the three capos, but there is nothing about Angelo's death. Whatever happened to him, it is not documented in the records Giuseppe kept. The Don nodded slowly, processing the information. Good. That gives us room to maneuver. If Dante finds proof of the deal, we can claim it was ancient history, settled business. But if he finds proof that we killed his grandfather, we have a war on our hands. One of the older capos spoke up, his voice gruff. Why do we not just eliminate Dante? Make him disappear before he can cause more trouble? Because that would start a war, the Don snapped. And we are not in a position to fight the Colombo family right now. We have other issues, other fronts that need our attention. We need to manage this carefully, diplomatically. We need to give Dante enough information to satisfy him without revealing the full truth. Marco felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was the danger of carrying the truth, the burden Giuseppe had warned him about. The knowledge he possessed was not just power. It was a responsibility, a constant calculation of when to reveal and when to conceal, when to use and when to protect. What do you need from me? He asked. The Don looked at him, and Marco saw something in his eyes that he had not seen before. Not trust exactly, but reliance. A recognition that Marco was now part of the machinery of power, a cog in the system that could not be easily replaced. I need you to prepare a summary of the records, not the full documents, but an overview, a narrative that explains what happened in 1987 without revealing too much, something I can show to Dante if necessary, to prove that we are being honest, that we have nothing to hide. Can you do that? Yes, Marco said. I can do that. But if you show him anything, even a summary, it opens a door. It invites more questions, more digging. Are you sure that is the path you want to take? The Don smiled grimly. No, I am not sure, but it is the only path I have. The past is catching up with us, Marco. All those secrets we buried, all those lies we told, they are coming back, and we have to face them one way or another. Prepare the summary, and pray that it is enough to buy us some peace. Marco left the estate and drove back to his apartment, his mind churning. He spent the next 3 days working on the summary, crafting it carefully, choosing each word with precision. He told the story of the 1987 betrayal, framed it as a tragic misunderstanding, a deal gone wrong, a moment of weakness that had haunted Salvatore for the rest of his life. He left out the details that would implicate the current generation, the connections that would lead back to the Don. It was a sanitized version of the truth, a half-lie designed to appease without exposing. When he finished, he delivered it to the Don, who read it in silence, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked up and nodded. This will do. It is not perfect, but it is enough. Well done, Marco. You have earned your keep. But as Marco left the mansion and drove home through the dark streets of the city, he felt no satisfaction, no sense of accomplishment. He felt only the weight of the truth pressing down on him, heavier than ever, a burden that grew with each passing day. Giuseppe had been right. The truth did not die. It only waited, and now it was stirring, waking from its long sleep, demanding to be acknowledged, demanding to be told. And Marco knew with a certainty that settled in his bones like ice that this was only the beginning. The past was not finished with them, not yet. The secrets they had buried were starting to claw their way to the surface, and when they finally broke through, when the full truth was revealed, it would burn everything it touched. The family, the legends, the lives they had built on foundations of lies and betrayal, all of it would come crashing down, and Marco would be there to watch it happen, carrying his burden, keeping his secrets, waiting for the day when the truth finally found its way into the light. The truth came out on a Tuesday morning in late November, 18 months after Marco had found Giuseppe dying in his farmhouse, 18 months after he had opened that trunk and discovered the terrible secrets buried inside. It came out not with violence or drama, but quietly, almost mundane in its inevitability, the way a dam fails not with a sudden explosion, but with a slow crack that spreads and widens until the whole structure collapses. Marco was in his office at the bookkeeping firm in Queens, working through a stack of invoices, when his phone buzzed with a text from Vincent. Turn on the news. Channel 7. Now. Marco grabbed the remote and switched on the small television mounted on the wall, flipping to the local news station, and there, filling the screen, was a face he recognized. Dante Russo, underboss of the Colombo family, standing on the steps of a courthouse in Manhattan, surrounded by reporters and cameras, holding a folder of documents. Marco's blood turned to ice. The volume was muted, and Marco fumbled with the remote, his hands shaking, finally getting the sound to work. Dante's voice filled the office, smooth and confident, the voice of a man who had just won a victory he had been pursuing for years. For 38 years, my family has been asking questions about what happened to my grandfather, Angelo Russo. We were told he died in a power struggle, that he was killed by rivals, that it was just the cost of doing business in this life. But we never believed that story. We knew there was more, something hidden, something that powerful people did not want revealed. And today, after months of investigation, we have proof. He held up the folder, and cameras flashed, microphones pushed closer. These documents prove that Angelo Russo was murdered not by rivals, but by his partners, by men he trusted, men he had made deals with, and specifically by Don Salvatore Lombardi, the so-called legend of the Lombardi family. These documents show that Salvatore made a deal with my grandfather in 1987, a deal to eliminate 3 of his own capos in exchange for territorial access. And when my grandfather fulfilled his part of that deal, when he proved his loyalty by carrying out those murders, Salvatore had him killed to cover up the betrayal. Marco felt the world tilt beneath him. This was not possible. The documents he had given to the Don, the summary he had prepared, had not included anything about Angelo's death, because there was nothing about Angelo's death in Giuseppe's records. But Dante had documents, proof, and he was standing on the courthouse steps revealing them to the world. "How did you obtain these documents?" a reporter shouted. Dante smiled, a cold, satisfied smile. "They were provided to us by someone inside the Lombardi family, someone who understood that the truth needed to come out, that justice needed to be served, someone who was tired of living with lies and decided to do the right thing." Marco's phone rang, Vincent's name on the screen. He answered, and Vincent's voice was tight with fury. "Did you give him those documents? Did you betray us?" "No," Marco said, his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. "I did not give him anything. The records I have do not contain proof of Angelo's death. Giuseppe's documents ended in 1987. Whatever Dante has, it did not come from me." "Then where did it come from?" Vincent demanded. "I do not know," Marco said, "but I am going to find out." He ended the call and stared at the television, watching as Dante continued his press conference, as reporters shouted questions, as the story spread like wildfire across the news cycle. Within an hour, it was on every station, every website, every social media platform. The Lombardi family, one of the most powerful criminal organizations on the East Coast, was being exposed. Their founding legend, Don Salvatore Lombardi, was being revealed as a traitor and a murderer. And the current Don, his grandson, was facing questions about what he knew and when he knew it. Marco's phone rang again. This time it was the Don himself. "Come to the estate, now. Do not stop, do not talk to anyone, just get here." The line went dead. Marco grabbed his jacket and ran to his car, his mind racing. Someone had leaked documents to Dante Russo. But who and how? The only people who knew about Giuseppe's records were the Don, Vincent, the 2 soldiers who had been at the farm, and Marco himself. Unless there were other records, other documents that Giuseppe had hidden somewhere else, documents that Marco had never found. The drive to Westchester felt like it took hours, though it was only 45 minutes. When Marco arrived at the estate, the gates were closed, guarded by armed men who looked tense and ready for violence. They waved him through after checking his identification, and he drove up to the mansion, where more guards stood watch, their faces grim. Inside, the atmosphere was electric with tension, with barely controlled rage. Marco was led immediately to the Don's study, where he found a room full of capos and soldiers, all talking over each other, all demanding answers. The Don sat behind his desk, his face pale, his eyes hard as stone. Vincent stood beside him, and when Marco entered, everyone fell silent, turning to look at him. Marco felt their eyes on him, felt the weight of their suspicion, their accusation. He was the keeper of records, the one who had found Giuseppe's documents. In their minds, he was the most logical suspect. "Did you give Dante Russo those documents?" the Don asked, his voice quiet, deadly. "No," Marco said firmly. "I did not. The documents I secured do not contain proof of Angelo Russo's death. Giuseppe's records ended in 1987. Whatever Dante has, it came from somewhere else." "Then where?" one of the capos demanded. "Where else could these documents have come from?" Marco thought quickly, his mind working through possibilities. "There is only one explanation. Giuseppe must have had a second set of records, documents he kept separately that he never told me about, or someone else had access to Salvatore's papers, someone who kept their own records of what happened. The Don leaned forward, his fingers drumming on the desk. Vincent, pull up the footage from Dante's press conference. I want to see those documents he was holding. Vincent had his laptop open, and within seconds the video was playing on the large screen mounted on the wall. They watched as Dante held up the folder, as the camera zoomed in on the pages visible inside. Marco studied them intently, and his heart sank. The documents were typewritten, old, yellowed with age. But they were not the same format as Giuseppe's records. The letterhead was different. The signatures were different. These were not copies of what Marco had found in the barn. These are new, Marco said. These are documents I have never seen before. Who else would have had access to Salvatore's papers? The Don demanded. Who else could have kept records like these? Marco's mind raced back to everything Giuseppe had told him, every detail of the old man's story. And then it hit him, a memory surfacing, something Giuseppe had said in passing, something Marco had not thought to question at the time. Giuseppe said he was not the only one who knew what Salvatore had done. He said there were others, men who had been there, who had seen the betrayal firsthand. What if one of them kept their own records? What if someone else documented what happened? The Don's eyes narrowed. The 3 capos who were killed. Did they have families, descendants who might have inherited their papers? Vincent pulled out his phone and started making calls, barking orders to soldiers to start digging into the backgrounds of Anthony Moretti, Vincent Catalano, and Michael Giordano. Within 30 minutes they had an answer. Michael Giordano had a daughter, a woman named Sofia Russo. She had married into the Colombo family in 1995, had changed her last name, had kept her father's identity secret for nearly 3 decades, and now, it seemed, she had decided to reveal what her father had left behind. She gave the documents to Dante, the Don said, his voice hollow. She has been waiting all these years, carrying her father's legacy, waiting for the right moment to strike back at the family that killed him. What do we do? Vincent asked. Do we eliminate her? Do we try to discredit the documents? The Don shook his head. It is too late for that. The story is out. The media has the documents. Law enforcement is going to start asking questions. We cannot put this back in the box. He looked around the room at his capos, at the men who had built their lives around the Lombardi family, and Marco saw something he had never seen before in the Don's eyes. Fear. Not for himself, but for what was coming, for the storm that was about to break over all of them. We need to prepare for war, one of the older capos said. The Colombo family is going to use this against us. They are going to demand reparations, concessions. They are going to try to take our territories. Let them try, another capo growled. We are still strong. We can fight. But the Don raised his hand, silencing them. No, we are not going to war. We are going to do something that my grandfather never did. We are going to tell the truth. The room erupted in protests, in shocked exclamations, but the Don's voice cut through the noise. Listen to me. The documents are real. We cannot deny them. And if we try to fight this with violence, if we try to cover it up, we only make ourselves look guilty. We only prove that we are what they say we are, criminals who will kill to protect our secrets. But if we acknowledge the truth, if we admit that my grandfather made mistakes, that he betrayed his own men, that he was not the legend we claimed he was, then we take away their weapon. We control the narrative. You want us to admit that Don Salvatore was a traitor? Vincent asked, his voice incredulous. I want us to admit that he was human, the Don said, flawed, capable of terrible things, but also the man who built this family, who gave us power and prosperity. We tell the truth, all of it, the good and the bad, and we use that truth to show that we are different, that we have learned from his mistakes, that we are not our grandfather's sins. Marco felt a chill run through him. This was what Giuseppe had wanted, what he had hoped for when he kept those records. Not revenge, not destruction, but acknowledgement. A recognition that the past had consequences, that the truth mattered, that the men who had died deserved to be remembered for who they really were, not as pawns in someone else's game. What do you need from me? Marco asked quietly. The Don turned to him, and for the first time since Marco had met him, there was something like respect in his eyes. I need you to prepare a full accounting. Everything in Giuseppe's records, everything we know about what my grandfather did. I'm going to hold a press conference of my own. I'm going to stand up and admit the truth, and I'm going to offer reparations to the families of the men who were killed. It will not bring them back. It will not undo the damage, but it is the right thing to do. Over the next 48 hours, Marco worked without sleep, compiling the records, organizing them into a coherent narrative, preparing the documentation that the Don would need. He worked alongside lawyers and public relations specialists, people who understood how to manage a crisis, how to turn a disaster into an opportunity, and slowly, gradually, a strategy emerged. The Don would acknowledge his grandfather's crimes. He would offer compensation to the descendants of the murdered capos. He would pledge to reform the family, to operate with transparency and accountability, to move away from the violence and secrecy that had defined the old ways. It was a radical plan, unprecedented in the history of organized crime, and no one knew if it would work. The press conference was held on a Friday afternoon in a conference room at a downtown hotel. The Don stood at a podium, dressed in a somber suit, his expression grave but composed. Behind him were Marco, Vincent, and several of the older capos, a show of unity, a demonstration that the family was facing this together. The room was packed with reporters, cameras, law enforcement officials watching from the back, and representatives from the Colombo family, including Dante Russo, who sat in the front row, his arms crossed, his expression skeptical. The Don began to speak, his voice steady, authoritative. "I stand before you today to acknowledge a truth that my family has hidden for 38 years. My grandfather, Don Salvatore Lombardi, committed acts of betrayal that cost the lives of 3 loyal members of our organization. He made a deal with Angelo Russo of the Colombo family to have these men eliminated in exchange for territorial access. And when that deal was fulfilled, he arranged for Angelo Russo's death to cover up his own crimes." The room erupted in a chaos of shouted questions, cameras flashing, but the Don continued, his voice rising above the noise. "I cannot undo what my grandfather did. I cannot bring back the men who died because of his actions, but I can acknowledge the truth. I can admit that the legend we built around Salvatore Lombardi was a lie, that he was capable of terrible things, and that those actions have consequences that we are still living with today." He paused, letting the words sink in, then continued. "I am here to offer reparations to the families of Anthony Moretti, Vincent Catalano, and Michael Giordano. I am here to pledge that the Lombardi family will operate differently going forward. We will be transparent. We will be accountable. We will honor the memory of the men who were betrayed by acknowledging what was done to them and making sure it never happens again." Dante Russo stood up, his expression hard. "Words are easy, Don Anthony. Promises are cheap. What guarantee do we have that this is not just another lie, another manipulation?" The Don met his gaze without flinching. "So you have my word, and more than that, you have the documents, all of them. Every record that my family has kept about what happened in 1987, I am making them public, turning them over to an independent oversight committee that will review our operations and ensure we keep our promises. I am giving up the power to control the narrative, to hide the truth. That is my guarantee." The room fell silent. This was unprecedented. A Don, voluntarily surrendering control, admitting guilt, offering reparations. It went against everything the Mafia stood for, against every principle they claimed to uphold. But it was also strategic, brilliant in its audacity. By acknowledging the truth, the Don was taking away his enemy's greatest weapon. By offering transparency, he was positioning the family as reformers, as a new generation trying to break away from the sins of the past. Dante studied him for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "We will accept your reparations, and we will be watching to make sure you keep your word. But understand this, Don Anthony. If you betray us, if you go back on your promises, there will be no more negotiations, there will be no more press conferences, there will only be war." "I understand," the Don said, "and I will not betray you. You have my word." The press conference ended, and the reporters rushed out to file their stories, to spread the news of this historic moment. Marco stood off to the side, watching as the Don shook hands with Dante, as Vincent arranged for the transfer of funds, as lawyers drew up agreements and oversight committees were formed. He felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he were watching all of this happen to someone else, as if he were a ghost observing from a distance. Giuseppe had been right. The truth had not died, it had only waited, and now it had found its way into the light, burning everything it touched, destroying the legends and the lies, forcing everyone to confront what had been buried for so long. But unlike what Marco had feared, the truth had not destroyed the family. It had transformed it, changed it into something new, something different. Whether that transformation would last Whether it was genuine or just another manipulation remained to be seen. But for now, in this moment, the truth had won. Later that night, after the press conference, after the deals had been signed and the reporters had gone home, Marco drove back to the farm. He had not been there since the night they had buried Giuseppe under the oak tree behind the barn, but he felt drawn there now, compelled to return to the place where it had all started, where a dying old man had given him a choice that had changed his life. The farm was dark and silent when he arrived, abandoned now, the house empty, the fields overgrown. Marco walked through the darkness to the oak tree and stood before the unmarked grave, looking down at the earth that covered Giuseppe's body. He thought about everything that had happened since that night, about the choices he had made, about the price he had paid for survival. He thought about the burden he still carried, the secrets he still kept, the knowledge that would follow him for the rest of his life. "I did what you asked," Marco said quietly to the darkness, to the ghost of the old Consigliere. "I told the truth. Or at least I helped tell it. It did not bring justice, not really. But it brought acknowledgement. It brought change. I hope that is enough. I hope that wherever you are, you can rest, knowing that the men you tried to protect, the men whose stories you kept, are finally being remembered for who they really were." The wind whispered through the branches of the oak tree, and Marco imagined he could hear Giuseppe's voice in it, rasping and tired but somehow satisfied. "The truth does not die, boy. It only waits." And now, the waiting was over. Marco stood there for a long time, alone with his thoughts, alone with the dead. Then he turned and walked back to his car, driving away from the farm, back to the city, back to the life he had built on the foundation of secrets and compromises. He did not know what the future held, did not know if the Don's promises would be kept, if the family would truly change, or if this was just another chapter in an endless cycle of betrayal and redemption. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He had survived. He had played the game and won, not by being the strongest or the most ruthless, but by being the smartest, by understanding that truth was not a weapon or a burden. It was a tool, something that could be shaped and used, something that could save your life or destroy it, depending on how you wielded it. And as Marco drove through the dark streets, as the lights of the city rose before him, he made a promise to himself. He would keep Giuseppe's memory alive. He would remember the old Consigliere who had chosen exile over complicity, who had kept the truth safe for 38 years, who had given Marco the choice that had defined his life. And he would make sure that the next generation, the young soldiers who were just starting out, would know the real story, the full story, so that they could make their own choices, so that they could decide what kind of men they wanted to be. The truth had come out. The reckoning had arrived. And in its wake, something new was being born. Not innocence, never innocence, but maybe, just maybe, a chance to be better than what had come before. A chance to break the cycle, to choose something different, to build a future that was not defined by the sins of the past. Marco drove on through the night, carrying his burden, keeping his secrets, living with his choices. A soldier in a family that was changing, a keeper of records who had learned that history was not fixed, that it could be shaped and told and retold, that the past was not dead but alive, demanding to be acknowledged, demanding to be heard. And somewhere, in a field behind an old barn, beneath an oak tree with no marker, Giuseppe Mancini rested in the earth, his testimony finally told, his burden finally lifted. The forgotten man who had refused to let the truth die. The consigliere who had chosen silence over complicity and had paid for that choice with everything he had. But in the end, his choice had mattered, his truth had survived, and the men he had tried to protect, the men whose stories he had kept, would be remembered not as victims or pawns, but as men who had lived and died and deserved to be acknowledged for who they really were. The circle was complete. The reckoning was over. And in the space between the past and the future, in the quiet moment between the dying of the old and the birth of the new, there was something that felt almost like peace. Not justice, not redemption, but acknowledgement. And sometimes, in a life built on lies and violence and betrayal, acknowledgement was the closest thing to grace that anyone could hope to find. Marco drove through the night, and behind him the farm disappeared into darkness, waiting for the next soul brave enough or foolish enough to dig through the past and uncover the secrets buried there, waiting for the next keeper of truth, the next witness to history, the next man who would have to choose between loyalty and conscience, between survival and honor, between the life he wanted and the life he deserved. The story was over. But the truth, as always, remained. waiting, watching, ready to be told again when the time was right, when someone new came looking for answers in the shadows, when the past demanded once more to be heard. And in that truth, in that endless cycle of revelation and reckoning, there was both warning and hope, a reminder that nothing stays buried forever, that secrets have consequences, that the choices we make define not just our own lives, but the lives of those who come after us. Marco understood that now, and as he drove into the dawn, into the uncertain future that waited for him, he carried that understanding like a shield, like a promise, like the burden and the blessing it had always been. The old farmer had died alone, but his truth had lived on, and that in the end was all that mattered. The end.